At its highest point, Schwinn wasn't just a bicycle company, it was the bicycle to millions of Americans. For many years, Schwinn sold more than 1 million bikes a year, and no other brand came close to its share of the U.S. market. In small towns and big cities, Schwinn bikes were everywhere. Shiny cruisers, fast 10-speed road bikes, and cool kid-sized Stingrays weren't just products, they were part of American life. Parents saved up to buy them, kids dreamed about them. A Schwinn wasn't just a bike, it was a symbol of summer afternoons, freedom and adventure. Schwinn made its bikes in Chicago. Its engineers worked hard to build strong frames and classic designs. Dealers all over the country proudly showed off Schwinn bikes in their stores. The company controlled how and where its bikes were sold. It felt powerful, confident, and nearly unstoppable. By the 1970s and early 1980s, Schwinn was more than a brand. It was a household name. Even as styles changed, many people still saw Schwinn as the best, the most trusted choice. For families, owning a Schwinn was a sign of quality and tradition. At that time, it seemed like Schwinn would always be on top. Its success felt natural, like the sun rising every day. But then, things started to change. The factories that once buzzed with work began to slow down. New bike trends like BMX and mountain bikes became popular, and Schwinn was slow to respond. Other companies, especially ones building bikes overseas, started taking customers with cheaper, trendy models. Schwinn began relying on the same foreign manufacturers, who would later become its biggest competitors. What once seemed like a smart business move quietly opened the door for others to take over the market. And then, not long after reaching its greatest height, Schwinn faced a shock no one saw coming. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1992. Its name was sold to new owners, its factories closed, and the empire it built crumbled. So how did something this powerful collapse? Long before the brand became a giant, before millions of shiny bikes rolled out of factories, there was just a young German immigrant with a stubborn dream. Ignaz Schwinn arrived in the United States in the late 1800s with little more than mechanical skill and a belief that bicycles were the future. America was loud, crowded, and competitive. He didn't have wealth or powerful connections. What he did have was patience, discipline, and the quiet confidence of someone who understood machines better than words. In 1895, Schwinn partnered with a businessman named Adolf Arnold to start a small company in Chicago. It wasn't glamorous. The early workshop was noisy, cramped, and filled with the smell of metal and oil. They built bikes piece by piece, frame by frame, trying to survive in an industry already packed with competitors. Many bicycle companies were popping up and just as quickly disappearing. The market was unstable, trends changed fast, prices dropped, rivals went bankrupt. But Ignaz Schwinn wasn't chasing quick money. He was obsessed with building bikes that lasted. That focus became his edge. While others cut corners, Schwinn doubled down on quality. Heavy steel frames, careful craftsmanship, strong parts. He believed a customer who trusted your product would come back and bring their children with them. The company nearly failed more than once in its early years. Sales dipped, the economy shook. But Schwinn was not the kind of man who backed away from risk. When competitors collapsed, he bought their equipment. When markets slowed, he invested in better manufacturing. While others played it safe, he quietly expanded. This mix of caution and boldness defined the company's early personality. Careful with quality, fearless with growth. By the early 1900s, the small Chicago operation was no longer just surviving, it was building a reputation. Dealers began to notice. Riders talked about the bikes that felt sturdier, smoother, more reliable. The Schwinn name slowly began to mean something. Not power, not dominance, just trust. And that trust, built in a loud factory by an immigrant who refused to quit, became the foundation of an empire that decades later would seem too big to ever fall. For years, Schwinn had been a solid, respected maker of bicycles. Good quality, steady sales, modest growth. But all of that changed with one bold idea. To build a bike that wasn't just transportation, but the best bike anyone had ever ridden. In the early 1930s, Schwinn engineers and leadership decided to stop chasing every passing fad. Instead, they focused on something deeper. A bike designed with precision, durability, and purpose. The result was the Schwinn Paramount, a performance bicycle built with lightweight materials and meticulous craftsmanship. It wasn't just another bicycle. It was a statement that Schwinn could build a bike that outperformed nearly every competitor's offering. This wasn't an easy or obvious choice. At the time, many manufacturers were slicing costs, churning out cheap bikes that looked flashy but fell apart on the road. Schwinn's leaders asked a different question. What if we built a bike that serious riders would choose over anything else? The paramount wasn't cheap. It wasn't for everyone. But for those who cared about performance, racers, long-distance riders, and cycling enthusiasts, it was a revelation. And the market noticed. Almost immediately, demand began to turn. Dealers who once stocked a handful of Schwinns started requesting more. Riders who had grown up on lesser bikes suddenly wanted something better. Something with Schwinn's name on the frame. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. A bike that was once a humble product in a crowded market became the standard for quality and performance. People didn't just buy the bike, they believed in it. They raced it, they showed it off, they told their friends. And with every new customer, Schwinn's reputation grew stronger. This was the moment Schwinn stopped being a small player and started becoming important. A craft company that once simply survived was now setting the pace. The paramount didn't just change the company's fortunes, it changed how the world saw Schwinn. It was more than a bike. It was the idea that pushed a quiet Chicago workshop onto the path of becoming an American icon. Success didn't explode overnight. Schwinn built its empire step by careful step, and almost every step was smart. First came control. Instead of selling bikes to just anyone, Schwinn created a powerful network of independent dealers. Local bike shops became trusted partners, not just sellers. These stores repaired bikes, built relationships with families, and proudly carried the Schwinn name. That system gave Schwinn something competitors struggled to match: loyalty at the ground level. Then came production power. Inside its Chicago factories, Schwinn focused on consistency. Parts were standardized. Processes were refined. The company learned how to make large numbers of bikes without losing the quality that built its reputation. This balance, scale, and durability became its secret weapon. Schwinn also understood image. Its ads didn't just show bicycles. They sold dreams of freedom, youth, and American life. Kids saw adventure. Parents saw safety and reliability. Schwinn became more than a product. It became a rite of passage. When trends shifted, Schwinn moved with purpose. Balloon tire bikes for comfort, sleek road bikes for speed. Later, the Stingray turned bicycles into playground status symbols. Each hit product pulled in a new generation of riders, and the numbers followed. Year after year, Schwinn's market share grew. Its bikes rolled into neighborhoods across the country. The brand spread beyond cities into suburbs and small towns, becoming a national presence. In the bicycle world, Schwinn wasn't just competing, it was setting the standard. By now the company's rise felt earned. Built on discipline, smart partnerships, strong manufacturing, and cultural instinct, Schwinn didn't stumble into dominance. It built its way there. By the middle of the 20th century, Schwinn stood at the top of the bicycle world. Not just as a company, but as an institution. Its factories in Chicago stretched across city blocks, massive brick buildings humming with machinery day and night. Sparks flew from welding torches, conveyor lines rattled. Workers in rows assembled frames that would soon carry children down sidewalks and racers across finish lines. These weren't small workshops anymore. This was industrial muscle. Schwinn led the industry in both reputation and reach. Its bikes filled showrooms from coast to coast. Dealers competed for the right to carry the brand. Competitors watched Schwinn closely, often following its designs and pricing. When Schwinn released a new model, the rest of the market paid attention. Financially, the company was strong. Year after year, sales remained steady or climbed higher. Generations of families returned to the same brand. Parents who had grown up riding Schwinns now buying them for their own children. That kind of loyalty is rare. Schwinn had it in abundance. Culturally, the brand was everywhere. Schwinn bikes appeared in movies, TV shows, and magazine ads that celebrated youth, freedom, and the open road. The Stingray became a childhood icon. The name Schwinn didn't need explanation. It was part of everyday American life. Inside the company, there was pride. Pride in craftsmanship. Pride in history. Pride in being the name people trusted most. Schwinn didn't just make bicycles anymore. It defined what an American bicycle was. From factory floors to neighborhood streets, the message felt clear: Schwinn had won. It had outlasted rivals, shaped the market, and built a legacy that seemed unshakable. But beneath the success, something was changing. Empires rarely fall because of one loud mistake. More often it starts with a quiet, reasonable decision, the kind that makes perfect sense in a boardroom. For Schwinn, that shift began with a belief. The old ways had worked for decades, so they must still be right. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the bicycle world was changing fast. Lighter frames, new materials, new styles of riding were gaining popularity overseas. But inside Schwinn's leadership, a different mindset took hold. One rooted in protection, not adaptation. The company doubled down on what had always made it strong: heavy, durable bikes built in its aging Chicago factories. The thinking was logical. American-made meant quality. Proven designs meant reliability. Long-standing dealer relationships meant stability. Why chase risky trends when you already owned the market? So instead of reinventing, Schwinn chose to preserve. At first it didn't look like a problem. Sales were still solid. The brand was still respected. Customers still walked into stores asking for Schwinn by name. On paper, nothing seemed broken. But quietly, something fundamental was being sacrificed: flexibility. The old factories were expensive to run and slow to modernize. The company's dealer-only sales model, once a strength, made it harder to move quickly or reach new kinds of customers. Meanwhile, overseas manufacturers were learning to build lighter, cheaper bikes with surprising quality, and they were adapting faster than Schwinn ever had to. To stay competitive on price, Schwinn began outsourcing some production overseas. Again, the decision seemed smart: lower costs, higher margins, a way to protect the brand while keeping up with the market. But this move came with a hidden cost. By shifting production away from the heart of its Chicago operations, Schwinn slowly loosened its grip on the very thing that built its reputation: tight control over how its bikes were made. The company that once obsessed over every weld and every frame alignment was now depending on distant partners. Nothing collapsed overnight. Customers didn't suddenly revolt. Dealers didn't immediately panic. Instead, the change was subtle, almost invisible. A little less control. A little slower to innovate. A little more focused on defending the past than inventing the future. And by the time anyone realized what had been lost, the foundation of the empire was already beginning to crack. At first, the trouble didn't look like trouble. It looked like small, scattered problems. The kind big companies believe they can outlast. In certain regions, independent bike shops began to struggle. Younger customers walked in asking for lighter European-style road bikes or the new wave of BMX models they saw in magazines and on TV. Some dealers quietly complained that Schwinn's lineup felt heavy, dated, and slow to change. Sales weren't collapsing, but they weren't as easy as they used to be. Still, from headquarters, the numbers looked stable. Then came the product complaints. Nothing dramatic, no massive recalls, no public scandals, just whispers. Frames that felt too heavy compared to competitors. Styling that seemed stuck in another decade. Serious cyclists drifting toward brands that embraced new materials and racing culture more aggressively. Inside the company, some engineers and managers noticed the shift. They saw overseas brands experimenting faster, responding to trends almost in real time. They understood that the Chicago factories, once a symbol of strength, were becoming expensive anchors. But those concerns moved slowly through layers of tradition and pride. Schwinn had been right for so long that being wrong felt impossible. In the broader market, something else was happening. Cycling culture was changing. It was becoming sportier, more specialized, more global. Riders wanted mountain bikes for trails, BMX bikes for tricks, sleek racing bikes for performance. The simple, durable neighborhood cruiser, Schwinn's old stronghold, was no longer the center of the story. And yet, leadership saw a different picture. Profits, while not exploding, were still solid. The brand name still carried weight. Dealers were still placing orders. From a distance, growth charts didn't scream danger, they whispered stability. Every spreadsheet seemed to say, "We're fine." So when regional sales softened, it was blamed on local conditions. When younger riders chose trendier brands, it was dismissed as a passing phase. When insiders raised concerns about slow innovation, the response was patient confidence. We've seen fads come and go before. The company that once thrived on bold moves was now leaning on past victories. And that's the cruel nature of early warning signs. They rarely look like alarms. They look like noise, like temporary dips, like someone else's problem. By the time the pattern becomes clear, it's no longer a warning, it's a countdown. Up until the early 1990s, most of Schwinn's troubles had been whispered inside boardrooms and dealer backrooms, subtle fractures beneath the surface. But then the cracks became visible to the world, and the company that once symbolized strength found itself at the center of public crisis. It began not with a dramatic recall or a headline-grabbing scandal, but with supply failures that rippled through the dealer network, leaving once loyal retailers frustrated and customers empty-handed. Bikes that had been promised were late, parts were mismatched, and quality that had once been Schwinn's pride was now inconsistent at best. Orders piled up. Dealers began to complain openly that Schwinn couldn't deliver when it mattered most, a shock for a brand that had built its reputation on reliability. At the same time, product lines that should have kept Schwinn competitive were failing to land with riders. Schwinn's attempts to catch up with emerging trends from BMX to early mountain bikes either arrived late or lacked the design and appeal that customers were excited about. While competitors like Trek and Specialized were capturing attention and market share, Schwinn's offerings looked behind the times. Then came the financial storm that could no longer be hidden. As revenues slipped and debt mounted, Schwinn's corporate leadership faced public scrutiny from bankers and investors. It wasn't just an internal struggle anymore, it became a battle over the company's survival. Schwinn violated financial agreements it had with its lenders, sparking tense negotiations that spilled into the public eye. The image of long-trusted leadership scrambling to convince bankers they were still solvent shook confidence. But the most chilling moment came when it became clear that this was no longer a temporary setback. In October 1992, Schwinn filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The news didn't just worry investors, it stunned customers, dealers, and an industry that had long assumed Schwinn's name was untouchable. A century-old American institution was publicly in crisis. For so long, Schwinn had managed perception with confidence, history, and cultural presence. But watching headlines declare financial collapse, dealers question orders, and customers hesitate at showroom doors, the myth of invincibility suddenly broke. What had been subtle and internal was now a public unraveling. The tone shifted across America, from admiration to shock, from trust to doubt. Schwinn was no longer just facing a business problem, it was facing a reputation crisis that could not be ignored. When the crisis hit, Schwinn's leaders didn't freeze, they acted. The problem was, they acted like the old Schwinn still existed. First came marketing. Glossy ads rolled out, polished and nostalgic. They showed smiling families, sunny streets, and the proud Schwinn name stamped boldly on every frame. The message was clear. We're still the brand you grew up with. Still the best. Still in control. But the market had moved on. Riders looking for cutting-edge mountain bikes and performance machines weren't convinced by memories. The ads felt like a company talking about its past instead of proving its future. Then came public relations. Executives gave confident statements about restructuring, temporary setbacks, and long-term strength. They blamed economic cycles, changing retail conditions, even impatient consumers chasing trends. Rarely did they admit that Schwinn itself had fallen behind. Inside the company, a different solution took hold. Cut costs, cut fast. Factories were closed. Jobs were lost. More production was pushed overseas to reduce expenses. On spreadsheets, the moves made sense. Lower overhead, leaner operations, a chance to stabilize finances. But each cut sliced away another piece of what made Schwinn. Quality control grew harder. Delivery problems didn't disappear. Dealers, once fiercely loyal, felt abandoned and under pressure. Some began replacing Schwinn floor space with faster-growing brands that offered better support and hotter products. Meanwhile, leadership dug in. Legal teams focused on protecting contracts and navigating financial obligations. Bank negotiations became survival battles. Energy that could have gone into reinventing bikes went instead into keeping the lights on. There was also denial. Quiet, but powerful. A belief that if the company could just hold on, just push through the rough patch, the strength of the name alone would carry it back. But a brand is not a life raft if the product underneath is sinking. Each response treated the crisis like a storm to endure, not a signal to transform. Marketing tried to polish the image. Cost-cutting tried to protect the balance sheet. PR tried to calm the noise. None of it addressed the deeper truth. Schwinn was no longer leading the future of cycling. And with every move that looked defensive instead of visionary, confidence eroded a little more. Inside the company, among dealers, and out in the market where riders had already started choosing someone else. For nearly a century, Schwinn's rise had been steady, almost patient, a slow build of reputation, loyalty, and dominance. The fall was nothing like that. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, market share began slipping fast. Riders who once would have bought Schwinn without hesitation were now choosing brands that felt modern, lighter, and more in tune with where cycling was headed. Mountain bikes exploded in popularity. High-performance road bikes evolved quickly. New companies didn't just compete, they led. Schwinn, once the standard, was now chasing. Each year, competitors gained ground. Trek, Specialized, and a wave of international manufacturers captured dealers, athletes, and younger riders. Shops that had proudly displayed Schwinn front and center began moving the brand to the side, or out the door entirely. The financial pressure tightened. Revenue shrank. Debt loomed larger. The cost of running outdated systems and scattered operations became harder to carry. What had once been a powerful manufacturing base now looked like an expensive burden. Cash flow problems turned from temporary strain into constant anxiety. Inside the company, the mood shifted from confidence to survival. Layoffs came first. Quiet at the beginning, then larger, harder to ignore. Skilled workers who had spent decades building Schwinn bikes were suddenly gone. Factory floors that once buzzed with activity grew quieter. Entire facilities were shut down as leadership scrambled to cut losses. Restructuring became the word of the day. Departments merged, budgets slashed. Long-term projects were abandoned in favor of short-term fixes. The company that once planned in decades was now thinking in quarters, sometimes in weeks. And it all happened with shocking speed. The same brand that had taken generations to build its reputation saw that reputation weaken in just a few short years. Dealers lost faith. Customers hesitated. Investors worried openly. Momentum, once Schwinn's greatest ally, had reversed direction. What had been a powerful forward march was now a downhill slide, and the brakes weren't working. In the final stretch, when the numbers were bleak and the pressure was constant, Schwinn reached for something it hadn't relied on in years: its own history. New leadership stepped in with a familiar promise. We're going back to what made Schwinn great. There was talk of rebuilding quality, strengthening dealer relationships, and refocusing on the kind of bikes that once made the brand legendary. Meetings were filled with words like heritage, craftsmanship, and trust. For a moment, it felt like a return to the company's roots. Design teams worked to improve product lines. Efforts were made to sharpen quality control. Executives spoke about restoring the brand's reputation, not just balancing the books. Dealers were reassured that Schwinn still believed in specialty bike shops and long-term partnerships. It was a sincere effort, not just corporate theater. But the world outside had changed too much. Competitors weren't standing still. They had years of momentum, loyal customer bases, and products already aligned with modern riders. Schwinn, meanwhile, was trying to rebuild while still weighed down by debt, restructuring, and a fractured supply chain. Trust, once lost, proved painfully slow to win back. Dealers who had been burned by delays and uncertainty hesitated to commit again. Consumers who had switched brands didn't feel a strong reason to return. Younger riders didn't have the same emotional connection to the Schwinn name that their parents did. Inside the company, the effort felt like trying to repair a ship already taking on water. Every improvement required money. Every delay cost more credibility. The brand's proud past couldn't fully shield it from present reality. The tragedy was that the instinct to return to quality, to rebuild trust, was right. It just came too late. By the time Schwinn tried to reclaim the principles that once made it unstoppable, the market had already moved on, and the company no longer had the time, resources, or goodwill needed to complete the turnaround. Hope flickered, but it wasn't enough to stop the end. In the end, there was no dramatic explosion. No single day when the machines suddenly stopped and the lights went dark all at once. Instead, the empire faded, piece by piece. After bankruptcy, Schwinn was no longer the proud, independent force that once ruled American cycling. The company that had shaped childhoods and defined an industry was now an asset to be divided, negotiated over in conference rooms instead of celebrated on factory floors. Ownership changed hands, then changed again. The Schwinn name, once stamped onto steel frames in roaring Chicago plants, became something else, a brand to be licensed, repositioned, and repackaged. Production moved fully overseas. The link between the name and the place that built it for nearly a century was finally severed. And in Chicago, the heart of the empire went quiet. Factories that once stretched across city blocks, alive with sparks, noise, and motion, were shuttered. Windows gathered dust. Equipment was sold off or scrapped. The skilled hands that had welded, painted, and assembled millions of bicycles were gone, scattered to other jobs, other industries, or retirement. The buildings stood for a while like empty monuments, physical reminders of a time when Schwinn didn't just participate in the bicycle industry, it led it. Dealers who had once proudly displayed Schwinn as their centerpiece now stocked other brands. Younger riders grew up without the same automatic connection to the name. To them, Schwinn was just another logo on a department store bike, not the gold standard their parents remembered. That was the quietest loss of all. Not just market share, not just factories, but meaning. The brand that once symbolized American craftsmanship, durability, and trust had been diluted by years of decline and reinvention. It still existed, yes, but as a shadow of its former self, detached from the dominance that once made it legendary. Contrast that with the peak. There was a time when Schwinn bikes rolled out of Chicago by the thousands, when kids circled Schwinn models in catalogs like treasure maps, when owning one felt like a milestone of growing up. There was a time when competitors followed Schwinn's lead, when its factories roared, and its name carried the weight of a promise. That company, the one that felt permanent, untouchable, is the one that ended. What remained was a reminder that even the strongest brands are not immune to time, change, and misplaced confidence. Empires don't always collapse in flames. Sometimes they simply lose the qualities that made them great until the world moves on without them. And somewhere in an old garage, a decades-old Schwinn still leans against a wall, heavy, solid, built to last, a quiet relic from when the giant truly ruled the road. Long after the bankruptcy filings, the factory closures, and the ownership changes, the name Schwinn still exists. You can still see it on bikes in big stores. You can still find vintage models restored with loving care. The logo survived, but the empire that once stood behind it, the culture, the control, the pride, the relentless standard of quality, that's the part that history remembers most, and that's where the lesson lives. Schwinn's story isn't just about bicycles. It's about what happens when trust, built slowly over generations, is traded away in small pieces for short-term protection. Each compromise looked reasonable at the time. Cut a cost here, delay an upgrade there, protect what worked yesterday instead of risking something new tomorrow. None of those choices felt fatal. Together they were. Dominance is powerful, but it creates blind spots. When a company leads for too long, it can start believing its position is permanent, that customers will wait, that reputation alone is enough, that the market will circle back. Success becomes a comfort zone, and comfort can quietly turn into complacency. Schwinn didn't collapse because it stopped caring overnight. It collapsed because small shifts in mindset compounded over years. The focus moved from leading the future to defending the past, from building the best product to protecting the balance sheet, from bold moves to careful preservation. By the time the danger was obvious, the foundation had already weakened. That's the cruel paradox of long success. It can hide failure while it's forming. Sales can still look decent. Brand recognition can still be strong. Customers can still remember the good years. All the while, the gap between what made the company great and what it has become grows wider, until one day, the numbers finally catch up to the reality. Schwinn's fall reminds us that greatness is not a permanent state. It's a practice, something that must be renewed, questioned, and rebuilt over and over. The moment a company believes its legacy will carry it without constant reinvention, the countdown begins. And so we return to the image from the beginning. A factory floor once roaring with life, sparks in the air, frames moving down the line. Workers confident they were building the best bikes in the world. Now imagine the same space years later. Quiet, dust settling in the corners, machines still but not forgotten. The name survived, the buildings did not, and somewhere between those two realities lies the lesson of the Schwinn bicycle empire. Even giants fall, not because they were never strong, but because they forgot that strength must keep evolving.